I heard you guys got nerfed. Hi, Zizaran here with another starter build for 3.15 Expedition League, and this is a Necromancer Detonate Dead, something that has for a long time been a powerhouse. Obviously, it got relatively nerfed compared to other builds, maybe in the past two patches, where it kind of fell out of the meta, but it should be very, very strong in relative power now, and it is exceptionally strong on things like Cortex and the Synthesis boss fights. This is a really, really good league starter and a great boss killer. If you're not familiar with any of my guides, we do it step by step so you can see exactly where to put what points at what times, so you don't need to be confused by just getting a full skill tree. And we're also including ascendancies in so you can see which one is taken in which lab. Bandit for the build is the skill point, so you kill everyone. However, helping Illyria, especially on hardcore, is never a bad choice since you get resist and mana regen, and that's going to feel really good early. You can respec later with 20 regrets and an Onyx Amulet. Pantheons is Solaris and Relic Cash. Now, Detonate Dead is a 2-button skill, and you can play this build on both an Inquisitor and a Necromancer. There are pros and cons to both. Necromancer is insanely strong. Obviously, on Inquisitors, you have Fun Hybrid, which I think is really enjoyable to play, but I think the Necromancer is slightly stronger. And yeah, it is a 2-button ability, so you have to put Desecrate down, and then you have to Detonate Dead. Now, for bosses, you would basically do Desecrate and then Vaal Detonate Dead, and then continue spamming Desecrate a little bit while the Vaal Detonate Dead is going off. It's incredibly strong, does a lot of damage. There is one downside where you would have quite little damage against bosses like Shaper and Elder, and also a little bit low damage against Cyrus. The reason for that is that we're using Corpse Life, and those bosses have like a lot of small HP monsters. However, if you're ever up against something like Cortex or one of the Synthesis bosses that can be quite formidable, you will literally one-shot those. Because we bring in special Spectres, there's like 4 or 5 special Spectres, we've listed them in the notes, like for example the Harvest monsters. We bring those in, and you basically one-shot the bosses, because they have such a high amount of raw HP that when we detonate their corpses that will be added to the Desecrate pool, we have insane amounts of damage. And the fights that I mentioned we have low damage on, like Shaper, the reason that even though we bring in corpses there are just so many low life enemies that spawn there that it affects our damage in a bad way. Now, something I want to explain is that this build uses the Spiritual Aid notable, and I want to make sure that I explain how Spiritual Aid works because it causes a lot of confusion. Spiritual Aid causes that increases and reductions to minion damage also affect you. And that means that increases and reductions to minion damage. So if a item, or let's say an ascendancy point, says minions deal 10% increased damage, this becomes the same as 10% increased damage. So it affects our actual spell damage or our fire damage. So it's very, very strong, since obviously the Necromancer gets, I think it's like 60% free damage from our ascendancy. We have another little bit of minion damage over here. We could pick up more here for 1 point. And we have then the access of being able to craft a Essence of Fear on a Scepter to get even more damage. So really, really good for being able to get global damage. And I want to make sure that everybody understands how Spiritual Aid works. Now for leveling, early on you can do like very, very standard with Stormblast Mine, Freezing Pulse, and then you can later on do Orb of Storms once you're level 4, and very, very traditional leveling here. Now, once we are level 24, you can see here, we're going to swap. We're going to start using Armageddon Brand, and we're going to start to use Cremation. Cremation is literally only used for either very high HP rares that you still want to kill, or bosses through the acts. Other than that, you're just running around casting Armageddon Brand. We're not going to be using Brand Recall, just cast a new Armageddon Brand per pack. We're also swapping from Herald of Thunder to Herald of Ash. We have Flesh and Stone, which blinds enemies, and you want to curse with Elemental Weakness. This you can play until early maps, and it might feel really, really good to map with this. But whenever you want like a large damage boost, you can swap to Detonate Dead. It is incredibly important that as soon as you can, you start leveling a Vaal Detonate Dead and just Detonate Dead gems in general. Vaal Detonate Dead is huge damage for the build, so use all your early Vaal Orbs on that, and you really want to make sure that you want to have a level gem. Sometimes we have people that are new to the game following our guides, and something that can be very common is that they'll switch from the leveling setup to maybe a level 1 Detonate Dead, which will have very, very low damage. So please make sure to level the active gems. That's very important. Support gems obviously helps, but not as important as the active gems. And active gems would be Detonate Dead, Armor Brand, Cremation, etc. Now for this build, we're going to do something quite different than the old Detonate Deads. So we're going to be using Trinity tech. And the way we're going to be proccing this, instead of casting Desecrate normally, like we would, and self-casting Desecrate, we are actually going to spell sing Desecrate, and we're using Frenzy to proc our Trinity. And since we have Trinity and the Detonate Dead as well, regardless of DD itself proccing the Trinity, we will have it fully charged from our Frenzy. So really, really cool there, and should feel pretty great to use. So again, we're using Frenzy. This will proc our Trinity for loads of damage on our Detonate Dead, and also gives us Frenzy charges, which is even more damage. Until you have a Flammability ring, you'll be self-casting Flammability, but once you have it, you can use either Race Spectre for even more damage, or you could use Steel Skin. So obviously, Race Spectre is used in the build to raise Spectres with really, really high life. And this is explained here as well. We can use Rusty Crusher or Auto Enforcer. These have 715 or 750. Later on, we can get Stone Skin Flare and Lithomancer from Primeval Ruins in Delve. And I do have a separate video that explains how to set up a Spectre bank. And if you're in Trade League, you can just ask in Trade Chat or Global and ask if anyone have these Spectres. This won't be noticeable while mapping for the damage, however for bosses it'll be a big difference. Also, if you are getting low on gem sockets, you could drop shield charge, but obviously getting Fortify from this is very nice, and you can easily use just Flame Dash instead. In the items, you can see that we have early game, mid game, and late game examples of what to use. Our early game example is very easy to get gear, because if we can make a build work with very little gear, that's gonna be great for new players, and it's very easy to scale then. So +1 fire spell seal gems early on, things like spell damage super early is fine as well, or fire damage, anything is going to help you early on, but as soon as you can get +1 fire spell skills. Whenever you switch to Detonate Dead, then just pure elemental or pure fire damage is by far the best thing, and +1 fire spell skill gems isn't as important for the Detonate Dead part, because we're actually using the explosion part and not the initial hit off the DD. Other than that, everything just has life and resists. Don't worry too much about where you're getting resists, just make sure that you are resist capped. In the mid game, you can see here that we, since we have Spiritual Aid, we can use Saphir Essence on a weapon, and so then minion damage is okay, fire damage is okay, elemental damage is okay, and +1 fire spell skill gem is still some damage, but not required. And then trigger is really good as well, so we can keep bone offering up all the time. Thorium Spirit Shield, same, just as much fire damage as you can get, and if you can get fire spell skill gems, and also fire damage as extra chaos is not bad here. Other than that, now we're going to start getting things like maximum life as extra energy shield, just to get a little bit of an extra buffer. On gloves, we can get the incursion mod with damage with hits against chilled enemies. If you are wondering how we're chilling, it's because of this node corpse spect. Enemies near corpses you spawned recently are chilled and shocked. And on the late game gear, there are some examples of enchants and just gear suggestions in general, so make sure you look at the red text. Now, as always, we have a large amount of information here in the notes, so make sure you check these out. Loads of information about different things. If you are stuck on anything, make sure you consult those. So on the Frenzy, make sure they're using added cold damage. This is very important so that our Frenzy is doing fire damage from Herald of Ash and then cold damage from the added cold damage gem, thus activating our Trinity, which will be shared between this and the DD. And remember, we're not spell slinging Detonate Dead. We are manually casting that. We're only spell slinging the Desecrate. Now let's quickly walk through like the normal checklist of things to answer for every build. And are there too many gems to equip? No, it should be pretty easy, especially since we can drop shield charge if you don't want to use that and just use flame dash instead. Can the player have mana issues? So this uses the Necromancer Ascendancy Essence Glutton, which gives you a large amount of mana regen, so you shouldn't have any mana issues. But if you do, an Enduring Mana Flask would solve all those issues, and you could also get things like regen on boots. As far as defense, sustain, etc. on this build, we are very high block chance, and we want to get a life on block shield. So as high a block as we can get is great. Offering effect chest would make that even higher, but really good system. We also have a small amount of regen that'll help, and generally the build is very tanky. Bone offering as well will give us additional life every time you block. As far as mechanical drawbacks or things like that for the build, obviously it is a 2-button build, very similar to Bladefall and Blade Blast, and not everybody really enjoys like a build where you have to do something before you do damage. So in this case, you have to Desecrate before you get to do damage, and that can sometimes catch you off guard. As far as financial hurdles for this build doesn't really have any. It's an incredible, really strong solo self-on build, and it's been used a lot by racers in really high competitive events. So really solid build, and should be not affected by all the nerfs in 3.15 as much as the others. I hope you guys enjoy the build. Let me know if you play it, and good luck in 3.15. Thank you guys so much for watching. Sub if you liked the video, but more importantly, try to die less than I do.